let's talk about the life and political theory of Niccolo Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli was a man of the Renaissance, but his life was full of controversies, even up to now, that if you are labeled as a Machiavellian, it's kind of denigrating. It's it's actually derogatory for someone to be labeled as a kind of Machiavellian. So how did this come about? Niccolo Machiavelli, who lived from 1469 to 1527, stands as one of the most controversial and misunderstood figures in the history of political thought. His name has become synonymous with immorality, deception, and a ruthless power seeking, a reputation that preceded his actual influence and often obscures the genuine sophistication of his political philosophy. When Shakespeare's Richard III declares in Henry VI that he will send the murderous Machiavel to school, the Elizabethan audience immediately grasps the association. Machiavelli represents villainy, duplicity, and the pursuit of power without moral restraint. Approximately 400 similar references appear in all of Elizabethan literature, suggesting that Machiavelli's notorious reputation was already firmly established during his own lifetime or shortly thereafter. The American Heritage Dictionary defines Machiavellianism as a kind of political doctrine which denies the relevance of morality in political affairs and holds that craft and deceit are justified in pursuing and maintaining political power. Yet, this popularized understanding fundamentally distorts Machiavelli's actual contribution to political theory. Machiavelli was not an amoral thinker advocating pure cynicism. Rather, he was a rigorous political scientist who recognized that politics operates according to its own logic and principles, distinct from, though not entirely divorced from, conventional Christian morality. As Isaiah Berlin observed, few works have scandalized mankind more deeply and continuously than the prince. Yet, this scandal often reflects less about what Machiavelli actually said, and it's more about the discomfort his ideas created in readers confronting uncomfortable truths about political reality. Let's go to the life and political background of Niccolo Machiavelli, his so-called formative experience. Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469 to a distinguished, though not really wealthy family. Florence itself was undergoing profound political transformation at that time. When Machiavelli was born, the Medici, a prominent banking family, controlled the government through their wealth and influence. So it was the Medici family who was controlling Florence when Machiavelli was born. But by 1494, the French invasion of Italy disrupted this oligarchic regime arrangement. The Medici family fell from power, and Florence reconstituted itself as a republic, with a more broadly representative Great Council of approximately 3,000 citizens. Now, this dramatic reversal shaped the political environment in which Machiavelli would begin his career. In February 1498, at a relatively young age of 29, Machiavelli was appointed to the office of Second Chancellor of the Florentine Republic, a position that placed him at the center of foreign affairs management. This appointment marked the beginning of 14 years of tireless service to Florence. Machiavelli traveled constantly on diplomatic missions to the courts of Europe's most important rulers, meeting popes, princes, and other leaders of his time. His work took him to the courts of Milan, Rome, Venice, France, and Spain, where he witnessed firsthand the political machinations of the Italian Renaissance and the emerging European state system. This extended diplomatic experience fundamentally shaped Machiavelli's political outlook. Italy during this period was in chaos, a collection of competing city-states torn by conflict, while more powerful nation-states, particularly France and Spain, repeatedly invaded the peninsula. Florence itself was rife with eternal factionalism, personal favoritism, bribery, nepotism, and corruption by the late 15th century. This toxic combination of internal decay and external predation created an environment where political theory could not be merely academic. It had to address survival and practical effectiveness. Now, what about this guy named Cesar Borgia? One particularly formative experience was Machiavelli's observation of Cesar Borgia, the Duke of Romania, who flourished as a rising political and military figure during Machiavelli's diplomatic service. Borgia was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, and his power rose and fell with his father's fortunes. When Pope Alexander died, Borgia's ruin followed swiftly. As Machiavelli's biographer notes, when Borgia's time had passed, Machiavelli observed him like an anatomist looking at a corpse. This dissection of Borgia's political career, the importance of decisive action, the careful application of violence, the futility of maintaining power without sufficient means. These would in turn provide crucial examples for the prince, which Machiavelli would write years later. Machiavelli's experiences extended beyond mere observation. He was assigned the responsibility of organizing a militia unit composed of citizen soldiers for Florence. The dominant military practice of the time relied on mercenary armies, and Machiavelli came to deeply distrust this approach. He believed that Italy's weakness stemmed in large part from its reliance on mercenaries rather than its native forces. His citizen militia enjoyed some success, most notably in the conquest of Pisa in 1509, though they were routed by Spanish troops in 1512. In 1512, Machiavelli's political career suffered a sudden and nearly fatal blow. Spanish defeat of the Florentine-French alliance led to the overthrow of the Republican government and the restoration of Medici rule. Machiavelli not only lost his position, but was subsequently implicated, apparently falsely, in a conspiracy against the Medici family. He was imprisoned, tortured, and released only due to a general amnesty declared to celebrate the elevation of a Medici family member to the papacy. This catastrophe proved paradoxically generative. Forced into idleness and separated from active political participation, which had been his passion, Machiavelli turned to writing about politics with an intensity born of frustration. As he wrote in a famous letter of 1513 to Francesco Vettori, he said, "Fortune has determined that since I don't know how to talk about the silk business or the wool business or about profits and losses, I must talk about the government. I must either make a vow of silence or discuss that." Machiavelli harbored hope that his writings might restore him to favor with the Medici. He wrote The Prince partly as an appeal to Lorenzo de' Medici, to whom the work is dedicated. In the dedicatory epistle, Machiavelli asks Lorenzo to recognize the great and unmerited sufferings inflicted on him by a cruel fate. This hope was ultimately disappointed. The prince did not achieve its intended purpose, and Machiavelli remained out of political favor. However, his enforced idleness gave the world its greatest works of political theory. To understand Machiavelli's significance in political thought, one must grasp the historical context in which he wrote and the revolutionary state system that he observed. Throughout the Middle Ages, European politics has always been dominated by two great supranational organizations, the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire. Both organizations claimed authority that transcend individual territories and political entities, restricting the sovereignty of the nascent states. This emergence of the modern state system required independence from these medieval structures. In those regions of Europe where church and empire maintained their greatest influence, mature sovereign states developed latest. Italy and Germany, ironically, the very regions where these institutions were strongest, remained fragmented and disunited until the mid 19th century. By contrast, in regions where the church and empire had less influence, such as England, France, and Spain. Recognizable states arose as early as the 16th century, with unchallenged governments pursuing their interests against other like entities and pushing aside the moral constraints embodied in natural and international law. Political theorists now recognized that the concept of state itself underwent very significant evolution during this time. According to the German sociologist and political thinker Max Weber, the state is a human community that claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force or violence within a given territory. The state's essence in this formulation lies in its incontestable power, its ability to enforce its will in the form of laws against all rival authorities within its territory. This required not only the absence of internal challenges to authority, but also freedom from external control by church or empire. Machiavelli was present at the creation of this new international order. While the term state or Stato had been used occasionally before, it gained widespread usage in something approaching its modern sense during the 16th century, precisely when Machiavelli was actively writing. This terminological development reflected deeper political changes. In the late Middle Ages, Italy anticipated the state system that would later characterize Europe as a whole. By the 15th century, Italy was divided among several significant powers, primarily Venice, Milan, Naples, the Papal States, and Florence, all rooted in city-states struggling for ascendancy. Although ruled by the Pope, Machiavelli regarded the Papal States as essentially another monarchical government in competition with others, no different in its fundamental orientation from its rivals. These city-states, in pursuing their conflicting interests, developed sophisticated mechanisms for sustained diplomacy. They established foreign offices, staffed by knowledgeable public officials, who maintained consistent policies transcending individual rulers' reigns. Similar diplomatic structures would persist throughout Europe and much of the world until World War I. Machiavelli's own role in the Florentine chancery made him a participant in these pioneering institutions. Beyond the internal dimension, Machiavelli confronted the internal decay of Florence itself. By the end of the 15th century, Florence had become a city rife with factionalism, personal, personal favor, bribery, nepotism, corruption, and even assassinations. This internal deterioration combined with external military vulnerability created a political crisis that permeated Machiavelli's thinking. He blamed the Catholic Church for Italy's failure to achieve political unity. Although the church lacked the power to unite all Italy under its authority, it possessed sufficient strength to prevent any other power from accomplishing this task. The church's temporal authority undermined the formation of strong, unified states, capable of defending themselves against foreign invaders. Italy's repeated invasions by foreign armies demonstrated this principle with brutal clarity. Military strength, in Machiavelli's analysis, formed the foundation upon which all other political goods rested. A state that could not defend itself militarily could not preserve its laws, institutions, or the welfare of its people. To appreciate the radical originality of Machiavelli's treatment of morality and politics, one must first understand the intellectual tradition that he rejected. Medieval political thought, as represented by figures like Luther, assumed that the proper role of the prince was fundamentally religious and moral. The ruler should aspire to be a good Christian, using his office to promote true religion and Christian virtue among the subjects. Humanist authors of Mirrors of Princes, the literary genre Machiavelli would employ, followed a somewhat different path while remaining committed to the integration of virtue and effective rule. Drawing inspiration from classical Latin authors, particularly Cicero and Seneca, humanist thinkers argued that virtue and expediency coincide. According to Cicero, in his book on moral duties, effective leadership depended upon possessing and displaying traditional virtues. To secure power over others, it was better to be loved than feared. Generosity appealed to a human nature more profoundly than parsimony. Clemency and mercy, as Seneca argued, were superior to cruelty. Above all, keeping faith, performing one's promises faithfully, constituted the foundation of justice itself. These classical authorities had an enormous influence during the Renaissance. Cicero's De Officiis, or On Moral Duties, was read and copied more often than any other work of Latin prose during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Humanist authors drew much of their advice for princes directly from this tradition, constructing what one commentator termed catalogs of virtues. This fundamental assumption underlying both medieval and humanist traditions was that the good ruler must be a good man. Virtue for a ruler was an extension of virtue for a private citizen. Machiavelli's originality lay in questioning this fundamental assumption in both his experience of the political world and his study of ancient history. Machiavelli discovered that the traditional virtues have little to do with political success. Instead, he claimed access to a higher truth, what he called the effectual truth, which he distinguished from imaginary or theoretical accounts of how things ought to be. Machiavelli's pessimistic anthropology forms the foundation of his political ethics. If people were inherently virtuous and trustworthy, then a ruler who practiced Christian virtues and treated his subjects justly might reasonably expect reciprocal virtue and loyalty. But the tragic fact is that people are not like this. Given this understanding of human nature, a ruler who assumes he will be repaid for a virtuous treatment with loyalty and reciprocal virtue is deluding himself. And what's worse, the ruler is jeopardizing the state. The ruler who behaves virtuously toward people who will not reciprocate that virtue is not only naive, but dangerous to the very state he governs. Machiavelli applies what contemporary philosophers call instrumental rationality. What is this? It means reasoning about means and ends to the political realm. If a prince wants to achieve certain ends, like preserving his state, or maintaining his power, or achieving glory, he must employ the most effective means to accomplish those ends. This form of reasoning is ubiquitous in everyday life. If you want to drive to a destination, you must use a car and keep it in good repair. To deviate from the shortest route merely for a scientific drive when speed is essential would be irrational. The difficulty arises because in politics, unlike driving to, let's say, a grocery store, the definition of ends is contested. Previous writers of Mirrors for Princes had assumed that the proper ends were religious, promoting true religion and moral, achieving justice and cultivating virtue among the citizenry. Given these ends, the prince should indeed be virtuous. But Machiavelli argues that previous writers have overlooked a crucial dimension of the prince's role. That is the political dimension. And what is that political dimension all about? The preservation of the state itself. Machiavelli apparently believes that the primary role of the prince is to preserve his state and secure his own position within it. A prince who sacrifices his state on the altar of virtue has failed in his fundamental duty, regardless of how admirable his personal morality or personality might be. Given this end, state preservation, the prince must learn how not to be good and to use this knowledge or not, to use it according to necessity. Let me repeat. Learn how not to be good and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity.